So in this stem, we're going to have a look at this as stem 3. We're going to have a look at Hatshepsut's claim to the throne and in her succession, and then her marriage to Thutmose. The first part's going to be quite long. There's a fair bit of content that needs to be covered, and the second part is very, very short indeed. So we'll get started. Okay, so claim to the throne and succession. The full dot point is claim to the throne and succession, divine birth and coronation release, but there's a fair bit we need to look at in terms of divine claim to the throne first and succession first. So we have to remember that Hatshepsut had become what's known as a regent. A regent is an English word which means that there's a caretaker king in place of the actual king, or ruling on behalf of the actual king, who is usually too young to rule in their own right. And this wasn't a brand new thing that Hatshepsut did. This had been happening many times prior, and in fact there had been female regents for young kings, and that was predominantly the task of the king's great wife, who would be the regent on behalf of their young son at the death of their husband. So we have two examples of that in times prior to Hatshepsut. We have king's great wife Tetisheri and Hotep, who had both been regents for their young sons. So it wasn't unusual. However, it was slightly unusual in that Hatshepsut was being a regent for someone who wasn't her actual son. It was her nephew and her stepson, so not actually her son. So Lawless says it was quite customary for these for King's great wife to be regent, but Callender and Tildesley say, well, it wasn't quite customary. It was a bit unprecedented because it wasn't actually her son. So there are a couple divergences amongst the historians that you might need to learn, or that you do need to learn. We have a source called the Biography of Anini, which is an inscription on the tomb wall of Anini, who was an official in Hatshepsut's reign. And he tells us that when Thutmose III became king, so Thutmose II died, Thutmose III became king, then he says his sister, that means Thutmose II's sister, his sister, the divine consort Hatshepsut, settled the affairs of the two lands by reasons of her plans. So that's our evidence that she became the regent at this time. So what the expectation probably would have been is that Hatshepsut would be regent until Thutmose III was old enough to become king on his own, and she would step down. And then at about that time, Neferure, Hatshepsut, and Thutmose II's daughter would step up and become the wife of Thutmose III. They would marry. That would be sort of the standard practice in Egypt. That's what we sort of expect to happen, but we don't have any evidence of that actually occurring. So we don't know whether it did or it didn't happen. But we do know that that Neferure died reasonably early on, well and truly before Hatshepsut died anyway. And Gramal, even though there's no evidence, Gramal, who's a French Egyptologist, suggests that they did get married. He believes that they did get married. But again, there's no evidence. What we do see is Hatshepsut, during the regency, consolidating her position, and Redford and Robbins really sort of push this point home. They talk about how she reinforced her authority, and she used kingly iconography and titulary, which is so she uses the portrayal of herself in kingly situations. That's kingly iconography, and titulary. So in other words, the titles of a king, and what she does to really cement her position as a piece of as a authority figure during the regency. So we'll have some examples of that. The first example is the promotion of Senenmut. Senenmut was Neferure's tutor from a young age, and he was obviously had a very good relationship with Hatshepsut, and then was promoted to chief steward, which was quite a high position within the bureaucracy. So he was promoted up the ranks, so that indicates that she's trying to secure support for herself, a support base amongst the bureaucracy, with people who are supportive of her. She also starts using the title God's Wife of Amun to gain support as well. So that title God's Wife of Amun that she'd had, she uses that and prefers to use that title God's Wife, departing from queenly precedence, which wasn't sort of normal, I suppose, at the time. She also has things like having scenes where she's depicted as a king. She has scenes where she's depicted at Karnak directly offering to God, to Amun, to the gods, which was normally only done by kings, and she wasn't a king at the time, she was only a regent, so that was quite unusual and unprecedented And we also have her modelling titles for herself based on what the ones that kings would use. For example, she calls herself Mistress of the Two Lands rather than what the king would call himself as the Lord of the Two Lands. So there are a couple of examples of some things that she did. A couple more examples are that she commissioned 2 obelisks while she was a regent, and that's unusual because normally only a king would commission obelisks or commission building works. That was a kingly prerogative. We also have another example here where we have the Red Chapel at Karnak, which was a chapel she built. That chapel was to house the bark of Amun, which was used at the Opet festival and the festival of the beautiful festival in the valley, where they carried the bark of Amun, which had the statue of Amun on it. And with that red chapel that was built, it was just built out of red blocks. That's what's called the Red Chapel. There's supposedly an oracle of Amun, which was supposedly choosing the king in year 2. So we're not exactly sure. It could have been King Thutmose III rather that it's choosing. We're not sure. And there's another one at the mansion of Ma'at where we think it could be trying to say that there was an oracle proclaiming Hatshepsut as the king. But that's sort of debated as to whether that's what the case was or not. So the next thing we need to look at is whether she would have had support to be able to do this, because it was quite unusual for a female to take on the role as a king and to continue it, particularly afterwards. So to do that, the historians all agree that she would have needed support. They don't argue with each other there. She would have needed support to make sure that she could do what she did. They think that the title God's Wife of Amun was really quite important in terms of her gaining support, particularly because the guys who were the Amun priesthood, this was a religious title. The God's Wife of Amun had a religious role sort of attached to it, so that would have had her in high standing with the Amun priesthood, who also were holding positions within the bureaucracy. So there's the argument whether between a couple of historians about whether the guys who were the priests of Amun were they given the title of a priest of Amun as a reward for good bureaucracy, or were they taking over the bureaucracy because they were so important as priests of Amun? So there's that sort of we're not really 100% certain on how that all worked. But we do know that by having that title, God's Wife of Amun, that gave her that religious authority, which also translated into political authority with those priests that were in the administration. So that's a really important point. We also think that probably the supporters of Thutmose I, so the administrators under Thutmose I, her father, probably transferred their support over to her and really supported her in that role as well. There's also a suggestion that because her husband Thutmose II was really sick all the time, that she would have played a bit of a role in politics while he was in charge. So because he was sick, she would have sort of stepped in there and gained a fair bit of political experience at that time. What we do know is that as a regent, she managed the affairs very competently, and she did a good job. Redford says that he thinks that she really needed the support of these key officials and really cemented their support during the regency so that she would have their support during the co-regency. And he suggested that the support of Senamut in particular, Onini, who we've already mentioned, and 2 others, Amos Pen-Nekbet and Hapusaneb, 2 really key officials, 2 other really key officials, really formed the backbone of her administration and supported her throughout that time period. The next thing we need to look at is Hatshepsut's, or the timing of it. When did she actually become the co-regent? When did the co-regency form? And there's sort of 2 possible dates. One is that it was in year 2 of Thutmose III's reign. So after the death of Thutmose II, we have Thutmose III. So she either became the co-regent 2 years after that, or 7 years after that. So we don't know. It's either year 2 or year 7 of Thutmose III's reign. She was crowned co-regent. So we're not 100% sure on that. So I'll quickly go through the debates for both. So the case for year 2 is that we have a block from the Red Chapel, and that there's an oracle there. This is the one I mentioned before, an oracle there proclaiming a king. And we've got one historian, Siegfried Schott, who believes that this is evidence for Hatshepsut's coronation. But we've got others who argue against. Calendar says that's not actually what it's about. That's not what the block's about. It's a presentation ceremony in the time of Thutmose I. meaning that it was a proclamation of a coming coronation, but it wasn't. So it was legitimizing something that's already happened, rather than, I suppose, saying that that it was actually happening, I suppose. The other case is for year 7 of the reign, and this can be a little bit confusing to try and explain it. And this is from Senenmut. There's a tomb with Senenmut's parents, and within that there's an amphora which says year 7. So we know that that must have been from at least year 7 that they were buried there. And Hatshepsut also in that same tomb has the title God's wife, which means that she was still regent. So in year 7, if she's still using that title God's wife, and that was in the tomb that's dated at year 7, then we know that she was still a regent. However, in the same tomb, there's a ceiling which uses her throne name, which she took when she became king, which was Martkare. So that would tell us that at year 7, she was still a regent, but also at year 7, or just after year 7, she was using the throne name Martkare, which would mean that she had become a king. So that's how they date year 7 as well. So there's two debates. Doesn't matter which one's right, just as long as you know the debates between the two. Okay, the next thing we need to look at is the divine birth and coronation reliefs, which are two reliefs which are depicted on the middle colonnade of Hatshepsut's mortuary temple, which is called Dir el-Bahri. She built this into the cliffs, so it was cut into the cliffs, and it's a really massive structure, and it's quite unusual, or quite new architecture. She was quite innovative with it. And in the middle colonnade, there's 3 colonnades. In the middle colonnade, she has depicted these scenes up on the walls, and there's 2 registers. A register means there's a higher bit and a lower bit. So one's on the lower register and one's on the upper register, and they sort of form a cycle together, so they sort of join together. So one's the divine birth, which portrays Hatshepsut to be born of the god Amun, and the other is the coronation scenes, which shows that she has the support of her father Thutmose I. So we're going to go through what they are and how they sort of go from there. So the first one we'll have a look at is the divine conception and birth scenes. So essentially what it shows is there's a council of gods is held, and Amun prophesies that Hatshepsut's going to be born. Amun comes down to visit Queen Ahmose, which is Hatshepsut's mother. Amun pretends to be Thutmose I, which is Hatshepsut's father, so he then holds an ankh up to, which is a symbol for life, up to her lips and to her nose, so maybe she's inhaling his divine essence. We don't really know what that means, and the ankh, you would have seen it, it's sort of like a cross with a loop on the end of it, and so she still thinks he's Thutmose I, so they copulate together, and then he reveals himself to be Amun, and she's very happy about that because now she knows she's going to give birth to a son or a daughter who's going to be divine. And he tells her that he's going to have a daughter with her, and the daughter will be called Hatshepsut, and that she will be the king. So this is all up there on the wall. Then he has Khnum, who's another god, who fashions Hatshepsut. So actually makes Hatshepsut and her car, which is her spirit, on a potter's wheel. So he makes these two tiny things on a potter's wheel, and they're both depicted as male, which is significant because she starts portraying herself as male. And then the Khnum's wife, who's called Heket, who is the frog goddess, she gives them both life. Then Heket and Khnum lead Ahmose, the Queen Ahmose, and you can see that when we look at the image, you'll see it in the eye book that she's slightly pregnant, off to give birth. Child's born. The deities of the house and childbirth, Bes and Taweret, and other gods who are there, they offer symbols of life, protection, power, etc., etc. And then there's another image there where we can see Hathor, which is like a cow god, a cow goddess suckling and nursing the newborn god Hatshepsut. So the whole point of that is that it's showing that she's actually born of Amun. So she's actually the son of a god or daughter of a god or whatever. Leading on from that, in the upper register, so that's on the lower register, in the upper register up above it is another scene, which is the coronation scene, and this follows on from the birth scenes, and this is legitimising her role in the eyes of her father, Thutmose I. And what it is, it's about Thutmose I choosing her as his heir to the throne when she's just a child. So the first thing is that Hatshepsut grows up as a divine king, and she's like a god, and she's very beautiful, etc., etc. As a child, she's purified, and Amun shows her to all the gods of the north and the south, and they sort of have platitudes for her. Again, she's depicted as male. Then Thutmose I takes her on a royal trip. They go around and visit all the shrines of the gods, etc. Then she's crowned by Atum at Heliopolis and then by Amun at Thebes. So 2 gods crown her. And you can see that here in this depiction here. So that's Amun there and that's Hatshepsut there, and she's being crowned by Amun at Thebes. So it's like she's being accepted by all the gods in both the kingdoms, in the upper and Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Then Thutmose I, who's sitting on his throne with Hatshepsut with him, and he has all these officials around him. He presents her to the court as his chosen heir and says that she'll be king as she is divine. So in other words, she's royal. She's also part god. She's born of Amun, so therefore she's going to be the king after me. And then we have other ceremonies follow, and Hatshepsut's eventually crowned. So essentially, they're the 2 scenes that are in the middle colonnade at Deir el-Bahari. They're both very, very important. You need to learn them. You don't need to be able to describe them, but you do need to know the significance of them. Okay, so were they real? What's the purpose of them, and what's the historicity? So the first thing we need to understand is that the first scene is demonstrating her to be the physical daughter of the god. So she was chosen by Amun. And the second one, the coronation scene, is that she was chosen by Thutmose I as the successor. Which is probably more important than being chosen by Thutmose II, because he didn't have much of a reign really at all, and Thutmose I was quite powerful and dominant. So it emphasised her right to the throne, and she does that by both of those scenes. So historians pretty much, they say, well, obviously the divine birth scene is garbage. It didn't happen, and that's all propaganda. But there is a bit of a debate about the coronation scene. So we'll have a look at what that debate is first of all. So Bentley tells us, he says, well, it's all garbage. That obviously she was never chosen by Thutmose I. It's just her writing after the fact to justify the fact that she's been king. So it's got no truth in it whatsoever. Gardner and Breasted agree. They say, yep, it's absolutely fictitious. There's no truth in it at all. And she's just rewriting history for propaganda to justify her claim to the throne. So they agree. So Gardner, Breasted and Bentley all agree it's just rubbish. She's just using it for propaganda. However, Callender goes off on a different track, and Callender says that they may have occurred before Thutmose II was even born. Because if you think about it, the fact, if she was named as the successor to Thutmose I, then why did Thutmose II become the king? So that's the argument put forward by Gardner and Breasted. But Callender goes on another tack and says, well, maybe Thutmose II hadn't been born yet, and Hatshepsut had been named as the next king. So Callender suggests that maybe this had happened really early, and then Thutmose II is born, and he becomes the king. However, that only works if Thutmose II is younger than Hatshepsut, and we don't know 100%. Some of the historians think he was, others don't agree and think he was actually older than Hatshepsut. So again, there's debate there. We've got a couple more historians here, Hornung and Helk. They believe that Hatshepsut was actually appointed a co-regent of Thutmose I, but then Thutmose II became the king after. So there's another example there. We don't know. So they think she'd already been a co-regent with Thutmose I. He'd taken her into a co-regency with him, but we don't know. And they also suggest that, well, we have the same scenes by later figures, and we say, oh yeah, that must be true. She must have been chosen by he must have been chosen by the previous successor. But it's only because Hatshepsut's a woman that we go, well, it can't be true. So they say there's a bit of an issue there. Last one is Kemp. Kemp says, look, it's completely rubbish. They're not true. It didn't actually happen, but this is what was expected at the time. So she was rewriting things not to justify her claim to the throne, but to keep what was happening within what was expected in Egypt. So she was writing what people expected to see. She didn't want to depart from what was normally the case in Egypt. So she was just in keeping with the tradition. So she had to keep that pattern going in what people expected. So moving on to where Hatshepsut is actually the king and the co-regent, she's become king. She takes on, what does she do? She first adopts that throne name, Mart Kare. She starts appearing in male form and costume, so wearing the kingly kingly clothes, the false beard, the uraeus, the Nemes headdress, all those things. She starts using Thutmose III's regnal dates. So she counts her reign from when Thutmose III became king. And they ruled together jointly in a co-regency. So the last thing we need to look at is quite big again, and that's the legitimacy. So was it legal? Was it legal for there to be this co-regency? A co-regency is normal when you normally have an older king who is close to death and he wants to ensure smooth succession. So what he'll do is he'll appoint his successor and they will rule together jointly for a period of time. And this had happened as early as the 12th century. Sorry, not the 12th century, the 12th dynasty. We've got examples of this happening. What we do know is that the Hatshepsut was the older, and she joined Thutmose III. It's not the other way around. It's not like she says, "Okay, you can be king with me." He's already the legitimate king when she's the regent, and when she becomes king herself, she's actually joining him as a king. So that's very different from what we see in the other precedents where we have an old king taking on a young person. It's the opposite, in fact. And what is also different is that the young person would always be the less dominant person until the old person dies. But what we see here is the person who came in second to the co-regency, the secondary sort of partner, is the dominant partner. So we've got lots of examples of Hatshepsut being the real dominant partner in the co-regency, and we'll see that when we look closer at Hatshepsut's relationship with Thutmose III later, that she's depicted generally before him, particularly early on. She's sort of shown in the dominant position in all of the imagery. The other thing is that she's not. It's normally the current king who will name a successor, but she wasn't the king. She sort of just appointed herself as the second king, which is also kind of unusual too. The other thing is that what Calendar argues is that it was really unconstitutional because Hatshepsut. Thutmose I was already crowned, and then she jumps in after him, or sort of comes in after him too, which is unconstitutional because he was already the king. So it was a little bit unusual, and where Neferure fits in the whole thing, we're not sure either. So there's a good quote here from Calendar, well worth remembering. So Calendar says, "She usurped the throne of a reigning king." Calendar says, well, Hatshepsut has just taken over. Of her own accord, and just taken over. We already had a reigning king, and she's just jumped in there and decided, I'm going to join in too. So we have to look now at the reasons for the coronations, because there's lots of historical debate here. Why would she do this? Why would she take over from a reigning king and join in the throne with him when she was only a regent? So the first one we'll have a look at is Redford, and Redford's the one who puts forward this heiress theory. He's the one that says, well, the royal blood flows through the matrilineal line, and there's matrilineal succession. So he says that we've got lots of examples of the queens and the queens' mothers having lots of influence in the 17th and 18th dynasties, and that matrilineal streak was really strong, and they were very quite stubborn women, and so they would have wanted to, she would have seen herself as probably the rightful person to take control. And he also talks about the idea of the God's wife title as being very important, and says that Hatshepsut was made of the same fibre as her grandmother, and that perhaps she wanted to begin this matrilineal succession and didn't want Thutmose III to be the king, didn't think he should have been the rightful king because he lacked the royal blood. Another historian, Lawless, says that kind of agrees and says, well, we've got lots of other queens prior to this that had lots of power. And they use the God's wife of Amun position as well, like first used by Ahmose Nefertari, and they've also, so she's sort of following in their example, following their lead, so to speak. Bentley sort of agrees with this too and goes a step further and says that Neferure was probably the next in line, and she didn't like the fact that Thutmose III had been the successor. So she eventually wanted Neferure to take take the role of king. And we have that idea of, Neferure had the title Lady of the Two Lands on her own, and so Bentley says that Neferure's got this title Lady of the Two Lands even though she wasn't married to Thutmose III. So that would suggest that in her own right she has earned that title, and that she's probably going to be the next successor to the throne. But that sort of defunct anyway, because Neferure dies quite early. He also suggests, Bentley also suggests that Hatshepsut really didn't like Thutmose III's inferior birth and didn't believe he should have been the king. And so she used that time in the regency to really consolidate a position, etc., etc. Calendar suggests that that Hatshepsut's right to the throne was endorsed when she was a queen, and she uses that Derrybarry Red Chapel scenes to demonstrate that. Believes that Thutmose I was presenting his daughter and his heir to the court, so therefore Hatshepsut believed that she should be the king, and that's why she sort of adopted that position. And we also have sort of Gardner and Hayes saying that the scenes were fictitious, and Hornung and Helk believe that Hatshepsut was chosen to be the co-regent of Thutmose I. And we also have the fact that in the second dynasty we have women are legally allowed to hold a kingly title, etc. So we do have examples of queens being king beforehand, but generally they're at the end of a dynasty. So he says not unconstitutional, it was allowed, it has happened before, so why wouldn't it happen again, etc., etc. They go on to say that Thutmose III was a falcon in the nest when he was made king, so he was very young. And that because the throne was promised to Hatshepsut when he died, she just decided, well, I'm going to take it now instead of Thutmose III taking it. And that Thutmose III had less royal blood than Hatshepsut, so she had the rights to it. We also have O'Connor, who says, well, it's probably more of a dynastic defence or self-defence mechanism. So in other words, she wanted to make sure that the dynasty remained intact. She was worried about, after Thutmose II had died prematurely, she was worried perhaps about Thutmose III being too young and dying early as well, and wanted to make sure that the dynasty remained safe, rather than sort of succumbing to outside pressures, etc. Robbins says that Hatshepsut sort of cemented her position during the regency, and Robbins sort of just disregards the whole heiress theory and says, well, there's no line of heiress queens, etc. And Robbins says, well, we don't really know, and we'll never really know why she did it, why she defied tradition, but we can suggest some ideas. And Robbins says, well, she's of a very strong character, and probably just didn't want to let go of the power. She accrued a lot of power and a lot of influence, a lot of authority during the regency, and just didn't want to let it go. And so didn't want to give up that power. Okay, so this next one is much shorter. This is her marriage to Thutmose II. What we see from Hatshepsut's marriage to Thutmose II is that she really did not depart from queenly precedents. She was a conventional queen consort. She did what was expected of her as a queen during the time as a queen with her marriage to Thutmose II. The titles that she held were King's Daughter, King's Sister, God's Wife of Amun, King's Great Wife, and a couple others, possibly God's Hand and the Adoratress of the God. So we have traditional scenes with her at a temple of Karnak wearing the traditional vulture headdress, which is worn by the king's principal wife, King's Great Wife. She started construction of a tomb, a queen's tomb, which was not in the Valley of the Kings, so that was not sort of unusual either. So most historians say, look, everything she did was exactly as you would expect of her to do as a queen. However, we do have an unusual stele which depicts Thutmose II, which is the husband, Hatshepsut, which is the wife, but remember they've got the same father but different mothers. Okay, and Queen Ahmose. Now Queen Ahmose is Hatshepsut's mother, but not Thutmose II's mother. And on the inscription for that image, you've got Hatshepsut stands behind Thutmose II in the traditional subordinate position, which is not unusual, but the Ahmose, Queen Ahmose in that, is actually called King's mother, but she's Hatshepsut's mother, not Thutmose II's mother. So that's a bit unusual there in that it says King's mother, but it's Ahmose, and that's only Hatshepsut's mother, not Thutmose II's mother. So Calendar says, well, Hatshepsut was already seeing some claim to the throne there, and maybe we have an example of maybe she was seen as more royal or whatever. But apart from that, we really only don't see her departing from any queenly precedents during her marriage to Thutmose II.